Yes, we'll talk about values in aesthetics and ethics. I don't remember the exact title. Do you?
Value and judgment.
Value and judgment. So if there are anti-realists here, there will be food for your thoughts. And so please, Akeel, the floor is yours. And perhaps you want to see this. Let's try. Or 1 second.
I think we have to be patient for a moment. Okay, Mario's back.
I start this way. Okay. You're here. Yes. For this. Yeah. Okay. I'll set it again there. So you can start.
Thank you for asking me. I'm sorry I've kept you waiting. I'm going to speak today about what exactly the place of value is in the world when it comes to questions of aesthetics and the humanities in particular. But I want to begin by pointing out that it's a very striking feature of scientific inquiry that from the point of view of that kind of inquiry, if one has a belief that is shown to be false, it cannot, and it's replaced by another belief. It cannot be a matter of regret. I'll repeat that. It's a striking feature of scientific inquiry that from the point of view of that inquiry, it cannot be a matter of regret if any particular belief one has is shown to be false and is replaced by another belief. Now, they're going to say, what are you talking about? That is surely not right, because I can regret that I thought some belief was true and I was shown to be wrong. I can regret that I was shown to be wrong. Or somebody might say, I regret that some medication that I had thought my experiments showed, that some medication that I thought my experiments had shown would be efficacious are not efficacious after all. I can regret that. Or more interestingly, somebody might say, I regret that my belief that the earth is flat was shown to be false, because I felt more at home in the world. I felt more cosmically safe when I believed that the earth was flat. So there are all these possible regrets. But all of them are missing the point. Because what I said was that it's a feature of scientific inquiry that from the point of view of inquiry, you can't have regret. All these regrets that I've just cited are not regrets from the point of view of inquiry. So what that shows is that it's an elementary mistake to think that we can regret from the point of view of the inquiry. But it also shows that the point of view of inquiry is just one of the many points of view we have on the world. Right? Because all these regrets issue from other points of view we have of the world. Right? It's just from the point of view of inquiry that we can't have regrets if a belief is shown to be false. So I've done two things at the same time. I've shown that it's a mistake to think that we can have regrets from the point of view of inquiry. But in showing that, I've shown that the point of view of inquiry is just one amongst many points of view we have on the world. The other points of view you have in the world can have to do with one's vanity. That's why one regrets that one is shown to be false. What it can be from the point of view of one's ambitions for curing people, for doing good in the world, that one can regret that something we thought was medically efficacious is not. Or from the point of view of looking for comfort, a comfort zone in the world from which we can have the regret about not feeling cosmically safe. So we have all these points of view in the world. They all can generate regret, but from the point of view of inquiry, there can be no regret. So I've done two things, shown that the point of view of inquiry, there can't be regrets, but in showing that, I've shown that the point of view of inquiry is to be put in its place. There cannot be, there are many other points of view in the world. It's just one small point of view on the world. Now, the curious thing is that in the modern period, the point of view of inquiry has refused to stay in its place. Right? There are all these other points of view, but there is a constant overreach of the point of view of inquiry, right, which tries to usher out these other points of view, to get a kind of centrality in modern culture and modern intellectual culture, and spreading over into modern culture, that there's this overreach. And this overreach has come to be called scientism. And scientism of this kind has obvious implications for how you think of humanities. This is obvious. Now, so I don't know if things happening here that you.
Oh, no, that doesn't affect that.
Oh. Ok, ce l'hai tu? Ah, no, usiamo il tuo per il video. Sì. Non importa, per l'audio c'è questo. Ah, Sofia, per favore, dai la credenziale dell'audio a Andrea Velardi.
Gli ho già mandato la richiesta per l'attivazione, deve cliccare però.
Non è arrivato.
Rifaccio, aspetta. Andata?
Sì, ok.
Ok.
They're complicated.
So the question I want to ask is it possible that there is a counterpart, a semblance of counterpart of this point of view inquiry, of this form of inquiry in the humanities? That's the question I want to start with. Is there a counterpart to this point of view of inquiry that I've been describing that is possible for the humanities, or could it be relevant to the humanities? Now, the curious thing is, of course, that I'm very keen to, I mean, there are lots of people who think today, for instance, Steven Pinker has claimed that the humanities is a complete mess and it would be very good for it to have this point of view, this form of inquiry as in some way brought in to be deeply relevant to the humanities. And in this, he's echoing things that C.P. Snow said many decades ago. And this advice from people like Pinker would be wise if Pinker had more anxieties about scientism. Pinker has very few anxieties about scientism, so this advice is not coming from a very wise source, because scientism is a great source of anxiety, it should be. So what I want to, that's why I was very careful to say, can there be a counterpart or a semblance of this form of inquiry which is relevant to the humanities? Those words counterpart and semblance are there to make it clear that if they had a relevance to the humanities, it would only be because they would modify this inquiry to take in the other points of view, which have all those human attitudes, etc., which gave rise to those regrets. So that's what I'm asking. Can we have the relevance of that kind of inquiry, but a counterpart of it, which, were it to be allowed to be relevant to the humanities, would have allowed much greater latitude and bring in a whole range of attitudes that are excluded from that inquiry in its official canonical sense. That's why I'm looking for a counterpart. And the counterpart to it, I'm saying, has counterpart to the goal of such inquiry. The goal of such inquiry is truth. The goal of scientific inquiry is truth. There's all those cliches about the disinterested pursuit of truth and so on, which excludes all these attitudes. But if we include all the attitudes, then let us say for now, in a tentative way, let us say that we should coin a new expression, saying truth belongs to this disinterestedness. Let's coin a new expression. Once you allow a whole range of interests and human attitudes and so on into such a point of view, such an inquiry, I'm using the word getting it right. So the counterpart, once you admit all these other attitudes into this kind of inquiry, would be getting it right. And getting it right is this richer, broader idea from truth, which is restricted to scientific explanation, prediction, etc. Let's say for now, we've got two notions: truth, getting it right, and it's getting it right that seems to be relevant for the humanities, because the point of the humanities is to include these wide range of attitudes, which, if you were to look at inquiry in a restricted way, they would lead to regrets and so on. Okay, so I want to just posit for now that there's a counterpart idea of getting it right, which is not exactly truth, and I want to explore that. Now, what is of great interest to me is that everything I've said now is completely misleading. Everything I've said so far is something you should have said gets it all wrong. Right? It's highly misleading, and I want to admit that. What I mean by that is that things are exactly the other way around. This kind of, the way I've put it so far is, we have this notion of inquiry, which is disinterested, which excludes all these other points of view from which those regrets flow. And I'm asking, can one enrich this kind of inquiry to include those other points of view and attitudes and culture and so on and so forth? But that's completely wrong, both from the point of view of intellectual history and from the point of view of analytic philosophy. That is exactly the opposite of how one should proceed. Because, in fact, in intellectual history, we had this richer kind of inquiry for centuries before this much more restricted notion of inquiry emerged in the modern period. You know, there's a marvelous article by Miles Burnett, the classical scholar and philosopher, in which Burnett points out that for centuries there was skepticism about the external world. But it's only with Descartes that skepticism about the external world began to claim that if we might not have knowledge about the external world, there might not be an external. That only came with Descartes. No skeptic in the tradition, say ancient skeptic, say Bilgrami, ever claimed that if you lost knowledge of the world, you would lose the world. That only happened with Descartes. So let's ask why. Why is it that it is only in modernity that loss of knowledge of the world was thought to amount to loss of the world? Why was this not thought earlier in the earlier traditions of skepticism? And one answer, obvious answer, is because prior to modernity, one took the view that there were other ways of relating to the world than via knowledge of it, by simply living in the world. It's only in modernity that the very idea of living in the world is so mediated by cognition and knowledge that to lose knowledge would be to lose the world. So, I point this out to say that it's only in modernity that we began to think of inquiry, which ushered out all these richer points of view, which are captured in the idea of living in the world. And it is completely misleading on my part to think of it as the disinterested form of inquiry as the basic one with efforts to amplify it by bringing in these up. It's the other way around. It was the amplified versions of inquiry were always there for centuries. It's only in the modern period that one abstracted away from the richer investigations to the narrow ones which present this particular point of view. So that's intellectual history is absolutely clear that I have misleadingly reversed this. And I've reversed it only because of the influence of scientism, which has made this form of inquiry so central to our intellectual culture. Okay, so that's intellectual history. But also from the point of view of just analysis, not speaking as from the point of view of intellectual history, but from the point of view of just plain analytic philosophy. It's very important to point out that the richer investigations, where all the attitudes and the cultures and social backgrounds from which those rich attitudes flow, which leads to those regrets and things like that, all those things are in fact analytically prior and more basic. So it's not just in intellectual history, but analytically. The narrow forms, the abstracted forms of narrow inquiry are dependent, conceptually dependent, analytically dependent on these richer ways of relating to the world that I described as merely living in the world. Now, one philosopher who pointed this out was Nietzsche in his remarkable work, Birth of Tragedy. Nietzsche makes this very loose and rich, distinction between Apollonian and Dionysian. And it's supposed to, he allows the distinction to roam over many distinctions: emotion and reason, unity and diversity, order and chaos. But I want to focus on another distinction that was very important for Nietzsche in making distinction, and that is the distinction between the representational and the non-representational, the discursive and the non-discursive. The Apollonian was the representational and the discursive, the Dionysian was the non-discursive and the non-representational. I don't know how many of you have an interest in The Birth of Tragedy. It's a very original work. It actually influenced all of continental philosophy, including Heidegger and the postmodern philosophers like Derrida. This particular distinction. And the important point that Nietzsche is making is that not just that in the modern period, the discursive and the representation, what we call a form of reason and knowledge, which we call logos. These things became very central only in modernity. Actually, Nietzsche places the fault line with Plato's Socrates, but you know, in fact, and so do all these European philosophers like Derrida and so on, their critiques of Plato and so on. But really, I think if you really want to understand scientism and its influence, you can't understand it except as emerging in the modern period, because the importance of science in culture, in intellectual and culture generally, only emerged when there were institutions around science, like the Royal Society, and so on. That only happened with modern science. That these institutions generated a centrality to science, which Aristotelian science never had. Aristotelian philosophy, what we call philosophy, what we now call philosophy in the broader sense, these distinctions were not made then, had a tremendous influence on medieval thought. But the counterpart to modern science, say Newton, so on, just simply did not have that centrality. Aristotelian science, in that sense, had no centrality of that kind in an earlier period. So the important thing to keep in mind is that in the modern period, logos, the conception of reason and knowledge in this fully propositional, discursive, language-centered sense, came to have a kind of prominence which it had never had before. And what I want to ask is, if I'm claiming that none of this logos, the centrality of logos, is possible, and this is really the deep point in Nietzsche, the centrality of this logos is not even possible. You can't even conceive of it, conceptualize its centrality without a background of non-discursive relations to the world. And this is exactly Wittgenstein's point in the philosophical investigations in his discussion of following the rule. So let me try and give you this analytical point that is there in Nietzsche and that is developed in finer detail by Wittgenstein in the philosophical investigations. What do I mean by saying that the very possibility of logos, of the kind of inquiry that science, logic, I would say even the law, explicit norms of the law, these would not be possible without a background, Dionysian background, non-discursive relations to the law. So this is precisely Wittgenstein's point as well. It's first said by Nietzsche, but it's there in Wittgenstein. Let me spell it out. It's very important to the points that I want to make. So, so what Wittgenstein is claiming, let's just look at what he says about rules of language. Eventually, his interest is in rules of language, but the example he gives is of a sign a traffic sign that you see when you're driving on the road or walking on the road, and you come across this. And Wittgenstein says, suppose we here in Rome see a sign like this, or in New York, or Oxford, sorry, Cambridge. You see a sign like this. Now, Wittgenstein says, how do we come to see it as telling us to turn left? What makes it possible that we see it as meaning turn left? He says, it's certainly not the case that each one of us sees it, scratches our head, says, what is this? And says, oh, let's interpret it as turning left. He says, that's certainly not what happens. We immediately, as soon as we see it as telling us to turn left. We just see it as telling us to turn left. There's no interpretation. We literally see it as turn left. The meaning is the object of perception. It's not as if the object of possession is some red paint on a wooden board, and then you interpret it as turning left. You just see the meaning. You don't see the paint of lines on the wood and then add some feat of interpretation. You just see this as saying turn left. But what makes it possible for us to see it as turning left? What makes it possible? And he says, the answer is a background form of life. The background form of life literally gives us this rich phenomenology, this rich perceptual sensibility, which sees meaning, not just sees a wooden board with paint, demanding further interpretation. No interpretation, you just see it as turning left. But what makes it possible? It says only a background, which is non-discursive, which does not consist of explicit rules, signs, logos, or anything like that. It consists of social memory, cultural practices, cultural history, all sorts of non-discursive phenomena. So let's make up a story. So imagine that we've been brought up reading comics, books, seeing movies in which arrows are used for target practice or for shooting down gringos, white colonial cowboys, and so on. Let's say we were brought up in a culture of movies, books, comics, where there's this use of martial weaponry with arrows. And we associate the direction of the arrow, right, as a result of this rich cultural background of social memory, of books and comics and movies that we've seen. So if we hadn't got all that in the background, we wouldn't be able to see this as turning left. So he says, so let's imagine somebody from an alien culture, right? Not in the West, but somebody, let's say, from some heartland of India who's not seen, brought up on these martial weapons. Let's say that somebody comes from a culture in which arrows are used for decorative purposes, not for shooting, just for decorative purposes. In this quite different culture. And by adding various details, we can say, as a result, this is the sought destination, and this is the starting point. In this culture where arrows are not used for shooting, where there's a direction of flight of the arrow, but there are other things in the background of the culture. And they will see it as saying, turn this way. So it's only acculturation into a set of non-discursive cultural practices, memories, and so on and so forth, that gives us the meaning right away when we see. We see meaning as a result of something in the background. All of these philosophers, Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Peirce, person is brilliant as a fixation group, make this distinction between a background and foreground. A background, which is non-discursive. Well, for Peirce, it's fairly discursive. We can talk about Peirce later in the discussion if anybody's interested. But anyway, so there's a background non-discursive and it makes possible and it makes possible that we see this directly as having a certain meaning. With a different background, you wouldn't see it. And this is completely non-discursive. It's cultural practice, social memories, etc. So this is explicit, this is propositional, this is logos, it's got rules, it's got codifications, and so on and so forth. This is completely haphazard. There's no codification. So here you have deductive logic, inductive logic, rationality in the codified sense of deduction, induction, decision theory, etc. Here, rationality is very much more loose. Okay, so I'm going to now, having shown those ways in which this rich way of relating to the world, which is non-discursively characterized, makes possible logos and all the rest of it that we've been talking about, which is the object of disinterested inquiry, in the mode of disinterested inquiry. Right? So Nietzsche, to Wittgenstein's point, is not merely that you can't elevate this and demote this. You can't have this unless you have this. In that sense, it's basic and prior. Without this, this wouldn't be what it is. Turn left. Right? Okay, now I want to ask, if this is right, what is the relevance of all this to the humanities and to the notion of value and judgment in the And I want to claim, there's one more thing before I answer that question. I want you to imagine one problem. Imagine that somebody in our culture, in Western culture, sees this and just doesn't get it. He doesn't see it as turning. Somebody in our culture just sees it, and unlike us, who immediately turn left, he just says, what is this? What am I seeing? And he's in our culture. What shall we tell him? Now, there's a certain kind of Wittgensteinian, and there are passages in Wittgenstein where he gets this impression too, but it's much more developed by people who claim to draw inspiration from. There's a tendency in Wittgenstein to some extent, but much more so in his devoted followers, to say, when you're if you're confronted with somebody in the culture who doesn't get it, you just tell him, this is how we do it. This is just how we do it. That's a bedrock assertion. You can't do anything better. So this is how we do it. See what I've said? What I've said is, we immediately see this because we have this background. I'm saying somebody has this background and he doesn't. What shall we do? Well, one answer seems to be quite prevalent, even in Wittgenstein to some extent, but in many others, especially. You just have no other choice but to tell this person, this is how we are, this is how we do it. I think this spoils the insight that Wittgenstein and Nietzsche were trying to do about the primacy and the priority, the more basic need to this, to make this possible. To say this is how we do it is to completely spoil the insight. It's what philosophers like Saul Kripke and Christian Wright do when they give their social account of meaning. They elevate what's in the background, put it in the foreground, and say, this is how we do it. It's an assertion of social authority. But if the social is here, it is not authority. It is the wrong way of thinking of the relationship between the social and the individual. And this is just as important for politics as it is for logos meaning itself. You cannot, and I think philosophers like Hegel and all are very careful not to make this mistake. You have to read Hegel along certain lines to do this. And the idea here is, you're spoiling the insight if you elevate what's in the background and declare it as a reductively defining relationship of the social over the individual. The social does not constitute the individual in that way. Look, not only does it cancel the right view that I'm saying is there in Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, the right view of Wittgenstein, not only does it cancel the right view, it cancels the very idea of reason. It is so wrong to do this that it is so wrong because it cancels not just the profound insight in Wittgenstein that I've been trying to describe about the relationship with this and this, but it actually cancels the very idea of reason. What do I mean by that? You know, when I was growing up, my mother would always say, don't do that. Stop doing that. Bilgramis don't do that. Don't do that. Bilgramis don't do that. And at some point in my development as a child, I began to ask, should I be doing what the Bilgramis are doing? And when I first began to ask that, I first was coming into reason. It's the most primitive first glimmers of awakening into reason to be able to say, should I be doing it? Wolves don't have it. Wolves are pack animals. They don't ask, should I be doing what the pack is doing? We possess reason. We possess reason only because we can ask of our upbringing and so on. Should we be doing it? And the reason why I call it reason is because what we're asking is, do I have reason to do what the Bilgramis are doing? Do I have reason to do what the Bilgramis are doing? Is the first kind of exercise of reason, the primitive early forms of exercise of reason. Now, if you just elevate the idea and say, this is how we do it, that question is cancelled, reason is cancelled. That's how deeply wrong Kripke's and others' understanding of rules is when they define the rule in terms of social. There is no reductive definition of that kind, so-called skeptical solutions of the rule following. So, what is the real thing that Wittgenstein and Nietzsche were trying to say? That this is spoiled by this. What they were saying was that the right relationship of the social to the individual is not this reductive defining. Right? This is how we do it. But rather, the very idea of being a rational agent is to be participating in the back, not elevating it into the foreground, but to be there is no bound, there's no end to the possibilities of getting something across, disclosing something to a person over here. So suppose this chart here is the one about martial weaponry. Let's call it martial weaponry. So this part of the background is the martial weapon. Everybody has this, every person who sees this as turning left immediately sees it because they have read books, comics, etc., in which arrows are used as martial weapons. But this is not sense. It's boundless, in fact, over here. So I might say to this person, instead of saying, this is how we do it, right? I might tell this person, wait, do you see that boat over there? Do you see that the boat has a pointed end and a wide end? Do you see that the boat goes forward at the pointed end? Do you see the similarity of the boat's shape with this? Do you see the similarity of the arrow going forward in the boat? I mean, listen, and that's just one thing you could tell any number of things. This is literally a boundless set of resources. You never have to say, this is how we do it. Because you never must cancel the person's participation here. Otherwise, the relationship between the social and the individual is sheer authority. This is not just authoritarianism about meaning, it's authoritarianism about politics. Right? It's something that I've been arguing for about internal reasoning and so on and so forth in issues of identity, because that's precisely what this is. So the point that I'm trying to make is that it is extremely important never to give up the insight that this makes this possible, and you never give that up for any reductive definition or anything like that. This is not codified. There are endless possibilities. Appeal to the visual similarity of arrows and boats, the visual commonality of direction of movement, etc. Those visual similarities and directional similarities give you a reason to see the arrow as saying turn left. That's not codifiable. You can't codify that into introduction. You can't codify that into induction, inductive logic, or decision theory. It's not codified. The space of reasons, which is a term that Sellers uses and McDowell uses, is infinitely wide. All sorts of things go into it. Not just logos, not just codified rationality. So now I'm going to come back to the question, how is all this relevant to the humanities? And I want to claim, I want to make a framework in broad suggestion for the humanities. Let's take just literature and art and criticism of literature and art as examples. I want to claim that criticism, say, in the literary and in the fields of literature and art, the point of all of that in humanities is that it is confronted with the tasks which are very similar to the tasks that one has. One is faced with somebody who's in the culture and can't see this at the same time. The critic, the humanist, is faced with the same kind of issues, that confront us when we're confronted with a person who doesn't get this, despite being in the culture. Why do I say this? Because it's the point of literature, art, etc., that it presents us with anomalies which make it interesting, force us to do the kind of spade work that's required, that takes us to looking at features which are not the standard conventional features which give rise to meaning, right? Which everybody immediately gets. The point of literature and art is that it doesn't just give you conventional meaning. It gives you all sorts of departures from that, for which you're confronted with the same task, and you have to look at the interstices of the background, not the normal places in the background, to disclose to the reader how to experience the artwork or the novel, the poem. Looking at not the standard parts of the background which give you the conventional stuff, but the other parts of the background, the interstices of the background. Otherwise, you see, the point of literature is that if it was just looking at the standard stuff, what it would be doing is, it would be just a handmaiden to what has already been figured out by sociology, psychology, etc. And then it would be, you read a psychology textbook, and it gives you examples. It gives you little cartoon illustrations. You've read this stuff, so-and-so for dummies, psychoanalysis for dummies, or, and they give you little cartoons. So you've figured out what Freud or Marx or whatever figured out in the discursive one, and then you just put in some illustration. But the point of literature is that it isn't just presenting what's been figured out somewhere, it's figuring it out in the non-discursive realm. That's what makes literature and art literature and art. And that's what criticism has to disclose to the reader, so that he aptly experiences the art and sees the value in art through. So this makes possible the disclosure of value and meaning in the humanities. Now, there are lots more things to say. How does these aesthetic notions of value and experience square with the moral notions of value and experience, which is equally part of the humanities? How does the notion of aesthetic pleasure square with this? All these are, how much time do I have? I'm willing to stop here. And
no, you can.
I can speak more?
10 more minutes. 10 more minutes.
Okay. So let me just take up the relationship. See, I'm very keen to say that when the critic, the humanist, looks at all these things here, points out all these things, and once you get what the critic is doing by appealing to these things, you come to see what's in the novel, to aptly experience what's in the novel. The value, the meaning, and so on of what is in the poem or the novel or the painting, etc., is disclosed to you via this direction of you to these features in the non-standard background, non-conventional background, right, in the interstices. But notice the words I've used. Disclose to you what is there. I'm saying it's there in the work. The critic really discloses you, tells you how to actually experience the work. You have to experience the work, but the experience has to be appropriate to the work. That's what is disclosed by Akeel. And if it's apt, it has to be a judgment. It's what Roberto was talking about. We were coming in the car and he was talking about phronesis. Well, that's the point. You can't get what's apt. It involves judgment. The apt judgment for that experience is what Aristotle called phronesis, except that he was mostly talking about the ethical. So you have to ask, but the humanities is equally interested in ethics. So what is the relationship between aesthetics and ethics? The humanities traffics in both. Now, my view is that it is, you see, it's a very interesting thing that in ethics, when you perceive meaning or value, when you just see meaning or value, or disvalue, when you see value phenomena, you're made to immediately act or want to act. It motivates you, moves you to act. So let's take Gilbert Harman's famous example. So Gilbert Harman has a famous example of you're driving along and you see in an alley some children, burning a cat. They're setting a cat on fire. Now, this is not Harman's view, but let me present it in accord with seeing the sign, etc. Let me say, you see cruelty. Right? You see a cat, you see kids, you see fire, and you see cruelty. You see all those things. You don't just have moral indignation, which you project onto the world and call it cruelty. Nothing of the kind. That's Hume and Adam Smith and all these anti-realists. I'm taking fully realistic. The cruelty is there, just where the fire and the cat and the kids are. You see cruelty. But if you see cruelty, then you're motivated immediately to maybe stop the car, get out, stop them, or whatever. But when you see art, or you read a poem or not, it's not immediate, right? It's one step removed. So, but it's there. So if you read Middlemarch, I don't know, once Casaubon's resentments and insecurities are revealed to you, you may resolve, I didn't want to live a life of insecurities and resentments and so on. Literature does have ethical effect on you. You may resolve, but it's not immediate. You can't go and stop the cat. Right? So it's if you like, it's I think somebody said it would be offline. In ethics it's online, in aesthetics it's offline. And it's one step removed, but I think it's a very short step. Right? And the term beauty was always used from the start to describe what goes on in aesthetics, because beauty moves us. But the mistake of aestheticism is to then elevate beauty into some sort of self-standing part. But that's not how it was intended. It was intended to be part of part of the ethical arts. The aesthetic arts and the ethical arts were inseparable. Otherwise, I couldn't resolve to overcome my insecurities after reading Middlemarch and coming to find the character, being shown to find the character Casaubon unappealing, etc. So I would like to, so I think the term beauty was always intended as an omnibus term summarizing all sorts of things, including the deliverances of the ethical arts, such as coming to resolve not to have insecurities. All of that was captured by beauty. It was not some self-standing separate notion which separates aesthetics from ethics. That's a late development with figures, and Oscar Wilde, of course, made it. So I want to invert the Oscar Wilde view. I want to say beauty is a misspelling duty. I think I'm going to stop and take questions.
Okay, so we thank you very much, Akeel. That was very rich. For questions, we can have questions here and questions at home. At home, I suggest that people raise their hand, and then if some people don't have the mic, they can write their questions, but please raise your hand, virtual hand from home and physical hand here. If you have questions. Yes, please.
Okay. So if I'm understanding you correctly, in the sign case, the idea is that the role of somebody who understands the content of the sign and explaining it to somebody who doesn't is to kind of invite them into the cultural practices that would reveal to them the meaning of the sign. And then there's a parallel with criticism, where there's, in the place of the meaning of the sign, there's a way of actually experiencing a work of art. And the role of the critic is to invite somebody into the cultural practices that enable them to understand the apt way of experiencing a piece of art. I was thinking about certain kinds of art, like abstract expressionism and like paintings written by Rothko, and it seemed to me relatively implausible that there was any apt versus inapt way of experiencing something by Rothko. I mean, I don't know, I can't imagine a way of experiencing it which I could characterize as inapt. It's not representational. Maybe somebody could be ignorant about the historical processes that led to its production or something, but it's not clear that that would be an aesthetically inapt way of experiencing it. So it wasn't clear to me that there's always this parallel between the sign and the piece of art, where the sign has a meaning and the piece of art has an apt way of experiencing it. Maybe in some cases, there is no particular apt way of experiencing a piece of art. And what do you think the role of the critic is in those cases? Or do you deny that there are such cases?
So if there's no apt way of experiencing it,
no inapt way.
No inapt way.
And no inapt way.
No inapt way of experiencing it. So you can take whatever you wish from it. But you don't want to make it a matter of will, so the word wish can't be correct there.
You're asking me?
Yeah, it isn't a matter of will, right? You may not get what is there, and you say there's nothing to get. Okay, but it wouldn't be the right way to say, it's not that you said it, I said it, but I wanted to get across to you that what I said was wrong, just so as to be able to proceed with giving a more detailed answer. It wouldn't be right to say, I can see it in any way I wish. It's not a matter of will. Okay, so if it's not a matter of will, then it's always a matter of what you are steered into thinking by one or other element that you bring to it from the background. And the question is there something in the background that are better ways of things to appeal to how we experience than others? And surely there must be. It can't.
I mean, I guess it would be helpful for you to kind of explain what you think about such a case. So it's a Rothko, so it's just a splotch of blue and then maybe a splotch of orange and maybe some blurring in between. And so then what would be a good way of responding, an apt way and a less apt way?
But suppose I said, oh, that really reminds me of my uncle's bedroom. And somebody says, well, you're appealing to some really inappropriate element here to have that experience. You know, surely there are things that one can say is completely inadequate to it.
I see. So your intuition is that it would be inapt to respond to that by thinking that it's.
There are any number of inapt ones, and some will be more apt than others. I mean, the point of criticism is to, I mean, if you look at, say, Harold Rosenberg's writing, say, on Rothko, he tries to steer you to elements. Many of the elements are of Rothko's influences within the history of 20th century art practice, right? So it's not appealing to the culture, but it's a part of the cultural background which is, you know what?
So what
It's not anxieties of influence, but facts of influence. You know, all sorts of things of that kind. I'm saying this is boundless. There are any number of things here where, which give you the resource to say this is inapt, this is more apt. That's what's the business of the art critic to do.
I see. So in cases where there is not, in a sense, a meaning fixed by the
Right.
what is represented itself,
Right.
what is apt can be constituted by the relation between the work and other works.
It
And
could
your
be.
appreciation of that.
I'm not taking any stand on it. I'm saying that's one way of doing it. I mean, somebody might say Cézanne is a much more important antecedent to this than, say, Raphael, right? When Cézanne got rid of lines, so he already began to make boundaries on the basis of color distinctions rather than linearity. Okay, that's not true of Raphael. So once you don't you see that's already an abstract. I mean, I'm not going to give you an account of it. Nobody can. But I'm just saying there are many things you can appeal to. This is literally boundless.
Okay. Now, Massimo, the Ludwig, and then Roberto. Massimo is there.
Okay. Hi, Akeel.
My
Good
dear
to
fellow,
see you,
how are you?
Akeel. I'm fine, thank you. It's very good.
Massimo,
Good to see you. Good to attend
one
you.
second.
Yes.
Non c'è il volume. No, c'è lo messo.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Akeel. I was saying hi. Hi, good to see you and good to attend a talk of yours. So my question is about truth. I'm pretty curious to know what happens to truth at the end of your talk, because you said at a certain point that you make the distinction between truth and getting it right on the other hand. And you said that getting it right is not exactly truth. But getting it right is, we can say, warranted assertability. So the pragmatist notion of warranted assertability, and which is considered truth as truth by pragmatists. And in the humanities, especially in aesthetics and ethics, truth could be warranted assertability. In other words, even if truth is not always warranted assertability,
Yes.
in these special cases, in special domains of discourse, is warranted assertability. So in a sense, the distinction that you made between truth and something else, getting it right, probably doesn't apply anymore. I don't know what
That's
you
a
think about this.
wonderful question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I should have said more about that, especially since I started with that distinction. And I'm very glad to have the chance to do that. You see, it's sort of interesting that somebody like Bernard Williams, who was extremely knowledgeable about the arts, nevertheless persisted in this distinction between truth and wanted to restrict truth to science, saying that in everything else there isn't truth. And the reason why he said that is because he thought that there was an argument that is needed always to show when the truth predicate is rightly applicable. And unless you have an argument, you can't just apply the word truth wherever you like. And he gave an argument. He said, he gave an argument to show why scientific inquiry alone deserves the distinction of truth. What was his argument? His argument was as follows. And this is an argument which he shares with Hilary Putnam and Richard Boyle. And the argument is, science is the only cognitive, it's the only enterprise in which there are results which accumulate and build on each other into a convergence. No other cognitive enterprise has this feature. Science is the only enterprise in which results accumulate, building on each other into a convergence. And he says, there's no explanation for why this is the only enterprise in which this happens, unless it's tracking the truth. And unless what it posits, electrons say, really exist. Right? That's Williams's argument. Okay. Now, ask yourself, when did this convergence that he's describing, which is his basis for saying truth should be restricted to scientific inquiries, verdicts. When did we begin on this convergence? That's the question I want to put to Williams. When did we begin on this convergence? This is not a question you can avoid. Did we begin on this convergence from the beginning of human thought? Ask yourself that. This is a really crucial question. Let us say science has this property of convergence, right? Results accumulating upon each other, building upon each other for convergence. So the question I want to ask is, when did this convergence begin? Did it begin from the beginning of human thought? That is absurd. There must have been any number for centuries, all sorts of false starts, false leads. And Williams, Putnam, Boyd are the first to say it only really began sometime in the 17th century that we began to convert in this way. That is important for the argument for restriction of truth, realism to scientific, the deliverances of science. Okay, so Williams says, all of these philosophers say that it starts sometime 17th century. Now, ask the other crucial question. Why does it start in the 17th century? Why? Why does it start in the 17th century? And they all say, because in the 17th century, we were set on the right path. Once we got onto the right path, then we began to accumulate. Right? So the idea is this. The argument is truth, realism, right, etc. The argument for this is that only in science do results build upon each other. Result 1, result 2, result 3. They build upon each other and they converge on something, and that deserves to be called truth. And the posits of electrons or whatever it might be, or fields, sparks, etc., are really there. Okay. Truth and reason, only because science alone has this convergence. So I first asked, when did this convergence begin? Did it begin with the beginning of human history in human thought? No. They themselves say no. So there are all sorts of false leads, which are all wrong. And sometime in the 17th century, you got on the right track, and then it began. Right? Okay, so on the 17th century, you got on the right track. All right. So I want to ask, what is this word doing here? What is this word? What do you mean by right track? If you understand what is right, you don't need this argument. You've already got what you're hankering for. If you analyze this, if you say what you mean by this, you don't need this argument. You've already presupposed what you're supposed to be arguing for. And what I've been trying to do is present through Wittgenstein and so on. And there's no reason to think that the notion of right must be restricted to explanation, prediction, etc. Why? I've given you an analysis of this based on the relationship between this and this, and it's there in humanities, it's there in science, it's there everywhere. Science, of course, has different goals. Wants to predict and explain. Certainly, anybody who's understood the hermeneutical tradition doesn't want to explain or predict or anything. There are all sorts of other things. But they both get things right. In the humanities, just as much in science, getting it right is the full prestige of truth.
Thank you. Roberto?
Thank you, Akeel.
And then John. Oh, sorry. Let me repeat it further. Roberto and then John.
Thank you. Akeel, you raised such a large amount of problems that is really difficult to choose something. Anyway, first of all, I apprehended this evening that your mother called Bilgrami and not Akeel, which is
No, cosa fanno i Bilgrami? Diceva cosa fanno i Bilgrami.
Bilgrami, but she said Bilgrami, you know, don't they do Bilgrami? They Bilgramis.
Yes.
So I didn't understand. But my question is obviously the core of your speech, the relationship between the background and the foreground, and the claim that in the foreground there is no reason, no interpretation whatsoever, because the hierarchy we go to left, singular. And, if you look at the boat, we see the boat which is difficult to understand, which is not true because there are boats. You have the stern and the boat is shaped in the same way. But, well, I'm not sure, even considering Wittgenstein, that it is really so that there is no reason whatsoever in the foreground. Because if we take some other example, think not only of the other, but think of the Gestalt theory and when I showed,
Hmm.
do you think there is no reason in seeing a vase or two profiles? Mm. Mm.
The-
I think in order to approach the core of your theory, I would like very much to know if you spend a few words on the notion of point of view, because you started your speech making the difference between the truth and different points of view.
Mm.
Would you be kind enough to tell us
Yeah.
a few words about the meaning of the expression, the content, the notion of point of view? What is there? What there is into the point of view? Thank you.
Right. Yeah, good. So that's a very basic and difficult concept to get clear about. And so the initial distinction I was making is that we can have a point of view on the world which includes a whole range of attitudes. So I have an interest in intellectual success or career success, and I feel very ashamed if I made a mistake. So I regret making a mistake. Okay, but at the same time, I have the point of view of science in mind because I'm a scientist, and from the point of view of science, I'm actually very pleased that I was shown to be wrong, and I have to accept that the Earth is round rather than flat. Right? So I have the point of view of science, and I have no regrets, and I have these other points of view: my vanity, my desire to cure people, and the cure I had in mind is shown to be false, not efficacious. I have the desire to be safe in the world. Right? From the point of view of seeking a cosmic comfort zone, the Earth is
I
flat.
think it is good in biology, but to own point of view in the sense.
I think those are very interesting questions. I mean, I think they may be emerged out of culture, and some of it may be biological. But you know, culture can transform what has been shaped by biology. Biology may not be. Some biology.
Think of Sapir-Whorf theory, really.
So think of.
Think of Sapir-Whorf theory of meaning in looking and interpreting the data.
Sure, no, that's a very important point. You see, but I feel that it's not just Sapir-Whorf. In science, people like Hansen, Norbert Russell Hansen, people like Kuhn, and so on, made it absolutely clear that your theory shapes what you observe. That's why you're appealing.
That's for sure.
That's what you're appealing to in some. Well, sure. So somebody might see waves where somebody else sees particles if they have different theories of light. Absolutely right. So if it can happen in science, why on earth should it not happen in culture or art? I mean, it's if it can happen. So if somebody says, okay, so science is just as bad. Okay, I want to say the glass is half full. Science is just as bad. I want to say culture is just as good as science, however bad it is. That's fine. That's the point I'm making, right?
So when we see three-dimensional, if we draw a cube, 3 dimensions, and in a flat place, because we have 2 dimensions. So the cube is science. The cube is science.
That's a good way. You abstract away.
it is.
You abstract away
Yeah.
from.
Okay, thank you. Now we have John.
John Cottingham also.
John, please.
No, he had his hand up first.
No, John first.
Okay, John. John?
Hi. Hello, Akeel. Thank you very much for the paper. Fascinating. I mean, you gave us some very persuasive arguments, I think, in a way, for dethroning science from its primacy. So instead of the supreme arbiter, you give us a picture of many points of view and attitudes, no one of which has the primacy. And that as you said in reply to an earlier question, I think leads us straight on to Bernard Williams and his rival idea of really of the primacy of science because of convergence. But now, what is it about that notion of convergence? I think we need to fill in there the Williams idea of the absolute conception. I take it his point is that the scientific representation can be the point of convergence precisely because of its concepts. It does not have among its concepts those which reflect merely a local interest or taste or sensory peculiarity. Now, at the very least, I think that does give us a prima facie case for saying that there's something special about science, insofar as it attempts to prescind from these peculiar perspectives and points of view. And I think that point might survive your bringing in the idea of a framework conception, because even granted that it presupposes a certain framework, nevertheless, in the way it develops its concepts, science, I'm speaking now in a way as devil's advocate on behalf of the scientist, might claim to prescind from local cultural peculiarities. And that's a case which does seem to me to deserve, it has some merit in it. Just wonder what you think about that.
So, but if even the verdicts and the outcomes and the deliverances of logos, science is the most regimented inquiry within the realm of logos, let's say. But if these two are dependent on a background of to get the meaning that they have, and somebody, whether it's about science or whether it's about anything else, may need to be directed into the right thing in the background, then I'm not sure where there's any place for an absolute ideal of reality. It seems to me just located. I don't want to deny that there's more convergence. In the argument I gave at the end, the idea was not to deny that there may be more convergence. Some people might deny that, and some people might say there's more agreement that slavery is wrong than there is in string theory. And I think that may be true. You know, there may be more convergence on the view that slavery is wrong than there is in the field of string theory, in the field of contemporary physics. And so that's one way you might go, but I'm not inclined to go that way. I mean, I think I have the instinctive sense that Bernard wants to go, that Williams wants to tap regarding somewhat greater convergence in science. But I really want to invest all my skepticism about elevating that fact of convergence into, in some way, showing the notion of getting it right or truth, which I don't distinguish between, as in the humanities as second class, because it does seem to me that both are dependent on the locational meaning constituting possibilities in the background.
Yes, but I take it part of the point would be that in your example of the road sign, without the form of life of which we're a part, we couldn't even understand it. We couldn't even, so without being human beings in a certain culture with a certain background, we couldn't make sense of it. In the scientific case, I guess the point would be that once we've developed these abstract concepts, pure mathematical and equations, quantitative equations, then the background kind of drops away like a rocket that's done the booster work, so that any rational inhabitant of the galaxy can see these patterns or forms as capturing something about the fundamental physical properties of the cosmos.
But that's exactly what Wittgenstein was put into question when he gave you those examples of plus and quos and so on, that even something as such as the notion of adding or plus in mathematics, how much more, abstracted away from the richer points of view can you get in mathematics? And he wants to say those could be subject to rule following, and all depends on whether the background is the right one or not. So I don't see that one is quite fully acknowledging the power of what Wittgenstein does with the rule following skepticism if one takes the view you're taking. The rule following skepticism point that Wittgenstein raises is precisely there to question whether science or mathematics or anything that involves meaning of that kind and concepts and contents of that kind could be seen as escaping it. I mean, maybe you're skeptical of Wittgenstein's points about rule following, but I'm completely convinced by them. I'm just unconvinced by Kripke's way of then ruining the relationship between the individual and the social.
Many more avenues that could be explored there, but I guess I might be reluctant to think that the purity of mathematics, in that sense of its cultural abstractedness, is an illusion. But I'm sure others need to raise questions, so let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, quick question, Akeel. So you ended up on a note on realism, and you said, and my question is how this relates to realism. So you said, you see the cat tortured, and you immediately perceive cruelty, right? Cruelty is there, it is out there. Now imagine you have different people with different background. In your picture, shouldn't, if you're not really trained to see cruelty, I mean, if you had really bad parents and you are detached from yourself, and you're not, I mean, you were not taught. Anyway, from the picture you draw out from Wittgenstein and the sign, wouldn't it be that what you see there depends on also ethics? Would that be the same?
It does. It does depend on the background culture, and I think that goes all the way through science, because that is a background. I mean, if you say that the wave theory of light, if you have a theory of light, which is the wave theory of light, then you will see waves where somebody sees particles. because they've internalized a different theory. This is just as true of science. If what you perceive is shaped by what you've internalized, whether it's a theory or culture or I don't see that there is that difference.
So what is the truth from the, if I have a different background culture, I don't see
But
that.
nobody's tempted to say that science is not looking at the real world and it's not getting truths. If you want to say that culture is as bad as, and literature and art is as bad as science, that's fine. I just see the glass as half full. I see it's as good as science. The point is there's no differential in when it comes to getting it right, I'm saying. We can't just, I agree with John that there's maybe greater convergence, right? But it has no philosophical significance of the kind that Williams wants to draw forward. I don't want to deny the facts that there's more abstraction and you ushered out many richer parts of the culture and so on, but it's the idea that you've therefore got rid of the background and you can't raise rule-following questions or anything like that. Well, that seems to me it concerns great insight. Well, you can always do that. The normativity goes all the way down. You've never got rid of it to get you the absolute conception.
No, because they had to listen to the question. So while you ask, I'll put this.
I want to bring up the argument because it's very useful to clarify all your position just in the interpretation of the adjective right. So your idea is that there is not a scientific rationality that justify the hegemony of the science, to lead up to a convergence, but this convergence rely on a much more higher level of rationality, that is the value rationality, the right directness of the value, and it is a matter of value, the possibility of science to make this possibility of convergence, not in order of the convergence to the fluid, but to the likely situation of a state of art in the present. So this is a very good interpretation of your position, I think, because the possibility of science to have an hegemony rely on a higher level of rationality, not in a scientific rationality. And in the position of Williams, there is a hidden mistake of the position of macho mainstream to interpret in a monistic way the science, as a monistic field. But science is a pluralistic field in which I think there is the possibility of the conjunction of background and experience too. Science is not doesn't exclude the level of non-discursive and experience, and this is very linked to the phenomenological level of Husserl, of the word of life. So, in regard the separation of background and non-discursive, this point about science and the right track, that you clarified just. There is the possibility to go beyond the dichotomy of about background and experience, to see that there are some fields in which there is a linkage between background and experience of non-discursive field. I think about the notion of habitus. There is a dynamical influence between background and non-discursive field, in which I can have an habitus that start from an experience, a background, and become an experience, something that is very implicit, that is very, very fast in my life.
I agree with that. But I agree that things that are clearer you can take things from here and put them here and study them, right? But when you do that, there will be other things in the background which make that possible. So you're never going to get rid of this distinction. And you can't take everything from here and put it here. You see, if you take somebody like Foucault, right, what I think is very wrong-headed about Foucault is that he thinks that with the Enlightenment or modernity, there were wholesale changes that, you know, and he doesn't have the distinction between the background and the foreground. So for him, modernity or the Enlightenment so on just simply makes a total displacement of pre-modern. And I'm saying that can't really be right, because if you see what I think the right way to express Foucault's anxiety, which is not his way of doing it, but the right way to express what might be anxiety inducing in the broadly Foucauldian sense, is that this is threatening to take over all of us. That's the right way to put it. Not that this has taken over all of it, and there was a pre-modern this, and now we've moved to all of which is, yeah, that's right. So the right way to put his anxiety is, this is threatening to take over all the ground there is, but that's conceptually impossible. It's impossible. The answer to that is to just appeal to people like Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and so on, who say, oh, plus, you can't give up this distinction because this is made possible by this. Now, there's no, as far as I haven't read every corpus, but I've read the great, interesting works by Foucault, like Discipline and Politics. You know, up till society must be defended, and I don't think he has this distinction.
Antonio, then there is a question from Fiona, then me.
My question was quite similar to Andrea's question. I just wanted to understand whether if your background, how your background is constructed, because it reminds me of Akeel in the structure, which makes the link between reality and us. So if you can say something more about your background.
No, I don't think it is structured at all. There's no structure. You see, I don't believe that there is a way of codifying, in any way codifying the background, because it's not discussed. It's predominantly non-discussive. You see, you could come to see something by something like Proust's Madeleine, just being generating a memory. The evocativeness of Proust's Madeleine is not codifiable. It's not discussive. And that's just one of the any number of he points out, not all boats are like this. All right, so you take the person to the right kind of boat. You take the person into the boat where there is this. I mean, the point is, if something like a visual similarity of one object can give you reason to see this as center and left, that shows that reason is amazingly diverse. The idea that reason must be structured, which is structured when you have deduction, codified in deductive rationality. But but just saying, see the boat, see the arrow, you see the similarity, and you tell me that's not codified. As he pointed out, you can't even show it to all boats. You can't generalize to all boats. It's got to be this particular boat that you.
It's not
No structure.
Can be codified, for example.
No, the strength of the point is that it has no structure. It would be to weaken the point to demand a structure.
Okay,
There was a question from Fiona, but the last message is that perhaps Akeel has given me the answer. Reason to the question. Okay, she authorizes me to ask questions anyway. Are there any implications from what you have said for how we think about the task of philosophy? As she was thinking about Heidegger and his idea that we need to turn to art and poetry if we are to truly comprehend things. And Schopenhauer and Nietzsche saying that reason distorts. And then she adds, perhaps Akeel has given me the answer, reason is as expansive as it needs to be.
Well, look, you don't have to go to Heidegger. You look at Chomsky. You see, what makes Chomsky such an honest thinker and such a powerful thinker is that he says 95% of language, thought, etc., is much better approached and more illuminatingly approached by literature. By literature. He says, what I've done is a very narrow aspect of language, syntax. He says, when it comes to semantics, meaning, Wittgenstein had it completely right. J.L. Austin had it completely. So you don't even have to go to Heidegger. I mean, Chomsky has such power, so modest. Right? You have Jerry Fodor saying, I'm going to extend what Chomsky has said to semantics. Right? So all of holism is said to be, I mean, basically you got rid of meaning because he says there's no more to meaning than denotation. Okay, so I mean, the point is Chomsky thinks that's comical to think that you could do things like that. And Fodor is a student of his, and they completely disagree towards the end with Fodor. So I'm feeling that yes, what this question is absolutely right. That there's, that's why I began by saying that you've got to put science in its place. And all of the struggle of the humanities has been because science has refused to stay in its place. And now Fiona has a question.
No, that's a question.
That is.
I read her question.
No. There's another question. Fiona asks, isn't rule following skepticism a problem only if you don't take home the message?
Oh, that's for you. Oh.
Right. So the rule following skepticism is, that's a exactly right question in a way. See, when I appeal to the rule following skepticism against, in response to John's question, my point was only to say that, as Wittgenstein shows, the point of the rule following skepticism is to say that normativity goes all the way down. All the way down. There's nothing, not mathematics, nothing else which can avoid the normativity that's exposed by saying that everything requires a bank. And it's precisely when somebody says, this is how we do it, right? Which is what Kripke's skeptical solution, that they want to say, no, after a point, it's the fact of the social which constitutes the norm. But if I'm right, and Wittgenstein's right, normativity goes all the way down. So the rules following skepticism needs no solution because, so my only appeal to it was just to say that if normativity goes all the way down, then you can't have an absolute conception of reality, which cannot exist as a conception that it is without ushering norms out at some level of characterizing the truth.
Okay, I have a couple of one question and two comments. The first comment is that the poor pattern doesn't belong to the group of bad guys anymore. So that's for sure. We sympathize with what you have said. And the second point is just about your historical side. I totally agree, but I think that there is also another root of the primacy of science on the humanities, and this is Galileo. It was probably a necessary step for starting mathematical physics. So Galileo had this idea that comes from Democritus and Epicurus. So there are only primary qualities. And that was useful to say, look, you can apply physics to the superlunar world, right? Because it was impossible for the Aristotelians, because they believe in equalities, right? Secondary qualities. Galileo doesn't. So if we remove the perceiving being, there are no secondary qualities. So physics can be applied to reality. Husserl has this point very clear, right? Husserl says, then from that, the view that only primary qualities exist was made absolute until everything else disappeared. But it was an important point for physics, of course. So that's another root of the idea that physics in particular can explain everything if everything is mathematical. So that's just the historical point that connected with what you said. And then another one, I'm totally convinced from what you said about arts and everything else. I think it's perfectly clear. I have a little more difficulties going back exactly to the arguments that Wittgenstein has about the rule following paradox or whatever, how you want to call it. And this is for mathematics, but could be also for common language. So there are two speakers there. One says 2, 4, 6, and it continues 9, 12. And the other one goes 2, 4, 6, 100, 220. And then the skeptic comes and says, there is no way of showing who's right there, right? Now, what is the way that you could go back and explain it to someone who doesn't understand the difference? It's not like the iconic arrow down. That's easy. But what is there is no iconic point there. There is not that going 2, 4, 6, 8 is better than going, or more clear 2, 4, 6, 100. So how would you respond to that?
Well, the idea is that there is you show that there is nothing that you can say to arrest the problem, because the problem isn't, as Fiona quite rightly points out, if you take this view, there isn't a problem, right? There's a problem because if you have a background, you just, you know, it's a little bit like saying snow is white is true, if and only if snow is white. And you're not going to spell out that there is what snow is or white is and so on. It's just simply irreducibly given in the disquotation, right? If you, once you start saying, I'm going to define snow in these terms and so on, you say, I'm going to define truth in terms of assertability and so on, then you have a problem, because you've given up on the irreducibility of truth, right? And somebody can say, is something warrantedly assertable true? It's what Hilary Putnam calls, I forget his exact term, but he's exactly right when he says, it's always open to, once you try and define truth, right? When you say in terms of something other than truth itself, which is captured by the disputant, then you can always ask, that is fulfilled. Is it true? Right? Just what,
like open question.
Just like GMO, exactly. So just like the open question. So the point is, that's exactly the point about the rule following. Right? You just can't say anything further. Right? This is how the culture, and but the point is, you don't say it. It's not the sort of thing you say, because then you elevate it into a skeptical solution. Right? So it's not. It's really something. The irreducibility of it is spoiled precisely if you point to anything other than, so it's the point of the rule following skepticism is that it's irreducible. Look, think of it this way. What is wrong with the idea of internal realism? The idea is you can't, suppose I were to say, here's a proposition, and it's true from the point of view of this theory. It's always, it's true from the point of view of what my view of the world, my Weltanschauung. And it is true from the point of view, but you can't say it. You know, once you say it, you pretended that you stand in some position outside of it. But you're not, there is no position outside. So in a way, the whole point of the rule following is to deny the view from nowhere, to deny. So there's certain things you don't say because you say it and you've made the reduction.
Excellent.
If you remain in a narrow field, you have more possibility to support the reliability of your judgment. And it is a very strange sense. So if you have a very strong constraint, of the relevant field, in which you have this relevant explication, the explication is more relevant in this narrow field.
It's not sayable. You see, because to say it, you have to be outside and say it's from this point of view, but you're in the point of view. So you can't say it. It's not a sayable thing. This issues from here, but you are here.
You cannot be outside.
You can't, there is no outside. So that's why it's irreducible. As soon as you say society, this is how we do it, you pretend it, and then you've made a reductive definition of it. But the whole point is it's irreducible.
This may be that, right?
Well, you know,
when he criticized.
that's the excellent part of it. When he, at the very idea of a conceptual scheme, but this is the really good part of it. Yeah, and that's why Davidson rejected Putnam's internal views, but Putnam himself went on.
Because it is a principle of charity that I have to comprehend better and better what is the position of your explanation in a very precise point of view of your visual world, etc. If I look only, if I focus on only your explanation, I could make a mistake if I exclude the point of view in which your explanation is rely on. It's right.
That's fine.
Okay, I think thank you again.
Thank you, Akeel.
Massimo.
Thank you. Next time I come, we must get together.
Sure.
Where are you?
And now I'm in Roma with a bit of flu. I was planning to come to see you in person, but I couldn't manage to do that. Very sorry for this.
Well, next time, Roberto also has a house in Sardinia, so we should all meet.
Great. All together. Ciao Akeel. Ciao a tutti.
Ciao.
Bye. Ciao Roberto.
Ciao,
Ciao Mario.
Ciao Massimo, ciao.
Ciao Andrea.
Ci vediamo presto, ciao.
Ok. Ciao.
Chiudo.
The families in Boston, Julia and the little girls are
Ciao,
there
Sofia.
for 2 years.
Ciao.